I do have one question about your use of the word louche, Colin.
Sure.
Loose, maybe, but louche, I haven't started drinking yet, and my moral integrity is at the moment intact.
See, I have started drinking.
Yeah.
So you say any moment now I'm going to abandon the screen and go and crack that bottle of wine. It is, after all, heck, it's Yardarm time somewhere in the world.
And I think anybody located in the United States today gets like a day off of
norms.
That's right.
Yeah.
Everyone mails it in. Today's a sweatpants day. We were all up too late last night. Very stressed
Push that envelope.
Yeah.
Oh God. Well, mail it in may not be the right expression. Because it won't
You're
be counted.
absolutely right. Yeah, it might be sitting in some post office someplace, hiding out, not getting its stamp on the right date. It's an excellent point. Yeah, but the word louche is interesting because it's not in common parlance in the U.S. But there was a show that I loved on the BBC called Posh Nosh. It was from I think it was from the 90s. It was hilarious, and it was these kind of rich twits in England. But one of the things they talked about was having a leftovers meal, which is different than having a meal where everything's freshly made. So they talked about having the vicar over for a leftovers meal. So what they would do is they would get a fresh loaf of bread and they would tear half of it off and throw half away. Now that's leftovers, right? And then they would open a bottle of wine, like a fancy Cabernet, and then pour a third of it out and put it on the table because that's leftovers. And they would say,
I guess,
it's freshly made food is so fussy, but leftovers is louche. Like that was what they said. So whenever I hear the word louche, I think about posh nosh. So that's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, and cheers to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should probably stop drinking because it's clear I'm the only one doing that. And now we're being recorded. So, but yes.
You're on record.
I'm on record, exactly. Hi, Jamie. Thank you for joining in. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Nicholas. Okay, so why don't we dive in? Because we have a lot to talk about here. This is actually our official iCoder meeting for Cyberweek and for November. So I think, wow, Jamie's got a visitor too. Jamie, who's that? Oh, we'll meet the cat later.
Uh-oh. Oh, hello.
All right, sounds good. We're going to count that as an official attendee. So in terms of iCoder announcements, there's a lot that's happening with iCoder. We have some new board members that are coming on after the first of the year. Alberto Elizavetsky is going to be joining us. Morenike Obiferende, who is presenting tomorrow morning, is going to be joining us on the board, and Graham Ross is going to be joining us on the board as well. So, Ian, I know we had talked before about the lack of representation from the Global South. We're doing a little bit better there. We can still do better. We're getting there. But the other thing is iCoder events are often scheduled during hours that work for Europe and the East Coast. And Ian has very patiently missed something like 10 of these in a row. So I said, Ian, we've got to do one that's going to be a good time for you so that we can make it New Zealand appropriate. So my attitude about this one is screw the Europeans. It's not a convenient time for them. Finally, we could do something that works for Asia. So I appreciate you stepping up, Ian, to the plate. So let me just begin with a little bit about Ian. Ian is truly, talk about a life well lived. I mean, Ian has done so many things. He's the director of the New Zealand Center for Conflict Resolution. He's on the faculty of law at Victoria University, and he's an independent mediator and trainer. He's been a consultant and trainer for many government departments, and was very early. He was a very early leader in establishing mediation and practices. And you did a book on dispute resolution in New Zealand. That probably is one of the definitive tomes.
Co-authored one. Yeah.
Co-authored, yeah. And I know you were a consultant and trainer for the World Health Organization in Sri Lanka in the late 90s, early aughts. And you were a visiting associate professor for the Faculty of Law, National University of Singapore. And you've traveled. Just talk about totally a world traveler. So you're definitely, I would call you a wild mind. I mean that as a compliment. I mean that as a compliment. You're always thinking big thoughts. And that's why I'm very excited about this conversation. And I'm eager for it we'll follow our noses in terms of the topics that we want to address. But it's an honor to have you here, Ian. And I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah.
Just May I just make a couple of corrections there?
Oh, sure.
I used to be on the faculty at Victoria University in Wellington. I left them 12 years ago.
Oh, goodness.
And at that point, I moved to Singapore and was on the faculty of the Singapore Management University. I had been for a year and a half at the National University, then was kind of seconded over to Singapore Management University.
Sure.
But left them 2016, and I'm been back in Auckland since 2016 and director of the Centre for ICT Law.
ICT Law.
Yeah, and so it was the conflict resolution used to be in Wellington and Singapore, but then I've moved into the ICT Law area in Auckland.
Got it.
Right now I'm on an island about 40 minutes offshore from downtown Auckland.
Wow.
And I'd show you the view, except it's, as we might say here, it's a crap of a day. It's a howling gale. It's
goodness.
Just awful. But we've had days of beautiful weather. But we're here because we're house sitting for friends.
Wow.
There's a view right out across the Gulf, and not only house sitting, but Jamie, I should compete with you. I could go and get 6 chickens to add to the collection because I'm chicken sitting as well.
Oh, you're chicken sitting. Wow.
Yeah, I have chicken duties. So, but,
well, actually, oh, please, Jamie, what were we going to say?
Oh, I was going to let him know I have 2 dogs at my feet, and I'm a farm girl. So
2 dogs and a cat and some chickens.
Yeah.
Actually,
horses.
Paul. Yeah, well, horses. That's more of a commitment. Paul Embley earlier today was saying that he is raising chickens now, and his wife is doing chickens, and he jokes about his eggs, which cost him about $25 a piece, based on
yep, that would be about right.
Cost to, by the coop and everything. But that's great. So we our session almost segued into chicken care, the care of chickens, but then we brought it back into ODR for the courts. So maybe we can do some of that too. Yeah, but a howling gale. All right. Well, I'm glad you're inside and you're safe. And because I guess here you're getting through spring towards summer, and we're getting through fall towards winter.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, great. Well, let's start out. Actually, the first topic I wanted to address is the Mediator Green Pledge, which I think is getting traction around the world. So I was wondering if you would just share a little bit of background on what that is, for the attendees that might not have heard about it before.
Sure. One way I've been thinking about that is basically it turns a necessity of recent times into a virtue. I mean, we've effectively all been obliged to carry on working like this online. And a few of us, John Sturrock, with whom you've had conversations, Colin, I know, Anna Howard, Sabine Koenig in Germany, a few began to have conversations about the fact that not only are we now obliged to work online, but actually there's some advantages in that. I mean, you commented earlier, Colin, on my peripatetic lifestyle. I'm embarrassed to say this is the first year since 2007 I haven't been to Europe at least twice.
Wow, that's amazing.
And so with a deferential nod to Greta Thunberg, I'm staying at home. It's also not only saving the planet, but it's saving my bank balance. But recognizing that having just moved some of our work, all of our work online, this is a way in which many mediators I'm in contact with have realized they can carry on working. They don't need to travel. Mm-hmm. And if you think too of the countries which are rather larger than New Zealand, and after all, there's only 5 million of us here, and we're not that far from north to south. But think of the expanse of Canada or of Australia. If you're asking people to fly or to travel great distances, that is not a clever way of using our time. It's not a clever way of using our resources. Mm-hmm. So having discovered, against some resistance, that this technology works pretty well. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. Mm-hmm. There are nuances that we miss, etc. And sometimes the protocols to which we'll return on the cultural context get confusing. A number of my colleagues have said, hey, now that I actually don't have to work this way and I can return to see my mediation clients online in real life, I'm not sure that I want to.
That's right. absolutely.
And finding that this is actually a better way of doing asynchronous mediation, of managing documents in single document spaces, of managing confidential conversations. Of course, there will be times when you have to meet people face to face. There will be times when there are things which have to be dealt with in a more personal way. But the combination of COVID, which forced us into this, and climate change, which actually also forces us into this, led to the Mediators Pledge. And you, Colin, put a copy of that up on, or link to that up on the odr.info website.
That's right. And on mediate.com. Yeah.
Mediate.com was on the front page last week or 2 weeks ago.
I think that's right. Yeah, it should still be there, yeah.
We now have about 140 signatories from across the world. And as of today, I met with John and several other of us, sort of the cabal who set this up. We are now setting up translations into Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and for New Zealand, Maori.
Wow.
Because I like to offend some of my friends by saying, actually, Maori is one of the two official languages, Maori and New Zealand Sign Language. They are the two which have statutory force in New Zealand. English doesn't.
I like that.
English is just kind of accidentally the official language, but we're translating into as many languages as we can over time to be as inclusive as possible. So it's taking off. It's had good traction. One question that's been raised by very, very few is it seems a bit prescriptive telling us we can't travel, but nobody's telling you can't travel. You're simply saying, do you need to? And do you need to require your disputants to travel? Even when I was living in Singapore, in fact, the year I left, 2016, beginning of that year, the Chief Justice announced that it was possible to appear in court in Singapore by mobile phone. Now, Singapore is 45 kilometers wide,
right,
and 25 kilometers deep. And it's got a really very good public transport system. Getting anywhere is not a problem. But why would you if you have to travel across town for a 5-minute court hearing?
Absolutely.
It's just not worth it. So the expectation was that you are dressed properly.
I see.
Counsel need to be dressed a bit more like Lynn is, except Lynn's being far too informal, not wearing a tie. But that can be improved. But I think almost coincidentally, COVID has taught us that the technology, which scared the living daylights out of a lot of people, is actually a boon. It makes life a lot easier. Some of my colleagues here in New Zealand, for whom travel is not a problem of distance, it is a problem of cost, find it's just a lot easier to work that way. So we're getting a few signatories here. We've got India, some from Africa, a smattering from the States, some from Canada. Got Alberto signed up very, very quickly, and Alberto is translating into Spanish for us.
Great. So, as soon as that's done, you're going to get 500 signups because Alberto is the Energizer Bunny. Yeah. So.
I'm just in awe of Alberto. I'm sure he doesn't sleep.
Well, his presentation today, I think, did a very good job chronicling all the things that they're doing. So I urge people to check that out. But, Noam, I think you were the first person, at least in my recollection, that made the connection between ODR and benefits, environmental benefits. That was the first article I ever saw on that topic. And for me, it was an aha moment. It was like, well, of course. I didn't even think about listing that as one of the reasons why the move to technology makes sense. But I think that not only is the pledge valuable, but I think quantifying it, doing some research. I think we do know now, especially post-pandemic, anecdotal information I've heard from AAA and JAMS is that resolution rates achieved via technology are roughly equivalent to face-to-face. So there's certainly no drop-off in efficiency. And I did a green calculator once, a carbon emissions calculator, and I was going through and it asked me all these questions about my life. And we have solar panels and I drive an electric car. I mean, I like to think I'm a pretty green guy. So I went through my whole lifestyle, and I'm vegan, so I was doing pretty well. And then it said, okay, tell us about your international travel.
Oops.
And I said, okay. And I said, well, I take maybe 2 international flights a year longer than 10 hours. And it quadrupled my my carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Everything in my life is dwarfed by those international flights, which makes sense, obviously, if you're flying up there with the jet engines burning that fuel high up in the atmosphere. So one of the other things that I heard is, in the United States, people said, there's no way we're going to hit our targets. No way we're going to hit our emissions targets. It's absolutely impossible. And then the pandemic hit, and now suddenly we're hitting our emissions targets because everybody's sitting at home and no one's traveling. So I do think that this is something we need to be more explicit about in the field. I don't think it's a reason why people are going to transform their practice in a vacuum, but understanding its benefit, I think, helps to reinforce the case to be made for ODR. So that's why I think the pledge is so valuable. So does anybody have other thoughts about this topic? Noam, do you have anything you want to weigh on? I mean, I know you've thought about this pretty extensively.
Well, I was just thrilled to see it come out, and I'm thrilled to see it get this stage, and I hope that it does, get the Alberto treatment and the everybody treatment. I think it's just, it's not just like you were surprised by recognizing your own, oh wait, I actually do all this. It's never fun thinking, hey, we're engaged in such a positive and constructive profession, and we're doing such good in the world, and it turns out that everything comes at a an and that's just how it is.
Well, you wrote in your article, I remember, Noam, about paper and about, there is an impact of printing everything out and having these documents over and over again. And again, another benefit of online is no dead trees, like that's another thing to think about. So an all-in carbon saving price per mediation or arbitration, that would be a very interesting statistic to apply to what's happened with JAMS and AAA and HKIAC and all these organizations over the last 6 months.
In that paper, which I will only say, 10 words about, so you don't have to go read it. It's also from 2012, so who knows what has changed. But the point was that we only measured what would be the effect of both a hypothetical and then a hypothetical real Cook County's arbitration program. What would be the effect of their going online, only from a carbon emissions for travel perspective, because we only looked at carbon emissions for basically for driving, and that was all we looked at. And then we listed a bunch of other stuff that we're not even calculating into that, such as paper, such as how much environmentally, what is the cost of keeping the lights turned on in a courthouse, and there are so many other things that can be measured. So I invite anyone who's into that to conduct some of those calculations and share them. I think that actual examples will have some effect.
Well, and I think the beauty of the pledge is it just gets people to think about it. Yeah, that's what it is. It asks the question, and I agree with you, Ian. It's not prescriptive. It's not like anybody's going to call me up and say, "Wait a minute, did you really have to drive to that meeting?" But it's just something to. I think it creates a sense of awareness and vigilance. So,
and on that, one of the things that John Sturrock suggests that even before we went live, his daughter did a beautiful logo, a green tick, and it was the mediators green tick, which he was wondering about mediators putting on their websites. And I said no, for two reasons. One is we don't award ourselves green ticks. They need to be awarded by some other agency, which applies external standards. And also there's a huge amount of skepticism about greenwashing. And that also would lead to the possibility that if any one of us who had signed that pledge then took an international flight, just imagine the skeptic saying, "Aha, gotcha, you took a flight, how dare you?" Right. Because it's not requiring us to stay at home. If, for example, the chance came up for me to work again in Sri Lanka, which I absolutely love, it's just a fabulous country. When I sit here saying, it's 2 flights to Singapore and then to Sri Lanka, I can't do it. But there is an issue about calculating the impact of your work. And I'm just wondering, as you talk, and I don't know whether you've got a thought on this, Noam, would it work and would it seem overly coercive to put a carbon calculator on the Green Pledge website?
I don't think so. I think that would be great.
Yeah.
I think many people don't know that there are such things as carbon calculators that you can enter activity into and find out what does this all really mean.
I'll chat with my friends about that, because it just only occurred to me when you were talking about the calculations that you'd done, because the other calculation I did a few years ago, I was teaching ethics in Singapore, and we were talking about modern slavery. You can do a modern slavery calculation, not that I have slaves, but calculating how much of what I own and do at some point possibly involves slave labor, and none of us can escape it. So it's just that oh God sense to think, I have to be more aware of the things I buy and throw away. Even the devices that we're talking through now are using probably conflict minerals.
Absolutely.
So it's about being aware of that. But I will, just following your comment now, I will raise the question with others about putting a carbon footprint calculator, because I know when I did the calculation, as you did, Colin, and I'm not as squeaky clean as you are, because I drive at the moment still a petrol car, and mostly vegetarian but not vegan. But we walk almost everywhere. But my flight carbon is just horrendous.
Well, there's no way around it. Yeah, there's no electric flight, unfortunately, not yet.
Yeah.
But I will say I have a friend who does work in Africa, does carbon mitigation work, trying to get people off of wood stoves and things like that and find alternatives. And he actually has on his website a calculator, a carbon emissions calculator, and you can buy offset credits. Yeah. So it says, okay, your input to the atmosphere is X amount. And if you want to buy credits, and essentially you're funding his work in Africa. So you're paying people to convert from wood stoves to more energy efficient mechanisms of cooking. And essentially that's being funded by, so I think that's another interesting way to think about connecting your calculator up. So I just think it's a good discipline, because people aren't aware. They don't put two and two together. So, more information is better. All right. Well, I want to move to other topics too, even though this is a rich one. Please, Jan.
I just wanted to comment, Ian, I am working on forced labor and slavery in the global fishing industry. And we're working on a supply chain decision tool that can basically capture that element in the products, like you say, the products that we buy. So I would think this concept will get traction.
Thank you. I mean, that's one of the things when I used to discuss with my colleagues in Singapore in the business school who taught supply chain stuff. It was a very big, because Singapore is a supply chain country. I asked, what do you teach by way of the ethics of supply chain? And they looked at me totally startled. Why would we? Because once you start digging too deep, you realize, I mean, the prawn industry in Southeast Asia is run on slavery. Don't eat prawns.
I know.
But it's almost, but needn't be, disabling when you realize just what the impact of our ordinary everyday life behaviors might be.
Anyway, thank you for sharing this.
I'm posting in the chat. I used to be on the board of an organization in DC called Resolve that was set up to do multi-party dispute resolution. But the executive director who came in while I was on the board there, he had expertise in conflict minerals, and he created a whole system for industry tracking. Because again, it's the kind of thing people don't realize. They buy a phone, they don't know where the minerals came from. So to be able to track that and put in your device and see, okay, where did this come from? What might I be supporting by making this purchase or that purchase? I think oftentimes corporations want to be responsible, but they don't have the data to know what responsible choices to make in terms of their supply chain choices. So it's that kind of tracking and tracing is very, very important too.
Also, even at our level, asking what it is you're willing to change in terms of your own purchases, because with the conflict minerals, and I know you want to move on from this, Colin.
No, this is a great conversation.
We will shortly. This is going to drive me to drink very shortly. But when we were discussing conflict minerals with my class, and it turns out that most of those minerals that are in, say, our mobile phones can be acquired in Australia. And the calculation has been done as to how much more your phone would cost if the minerals came from Australia. And I asked the kids in the class, how much more would you be willing to pay for a phone if they had non-conflict minerals? It turned out your phone would cost $1 more.
$1, right.
Wow.
And $1. And the students, the little bastards, said, nah, not willing to pay it. If it cost me more.
Ian.
well, amongst the many reasons why I left, I couldn't bear that kind of calculation. But think, yes, if it's $100 more, you might slow down, but $1 for God's sake.
You know, this is very relevant to the third topic I want to get to, which is the use of technology to kind of create connection and slightly more awareness and empathy around the world. Because I do feel like there is an aspect, and I see this there's a certain cruelty in some of the communities I've been part of in the United States. It's like, I don't care what happens to somebody else. You know, if my phone can be $5 cheaper, you know, what does that have to do with me if some person is in misery because, you know, their working conditions aren't safe? But, you know, hopefully let's come back. Let's loop back to that because I think that's an important topic. But the other topic I wanted to address, and I think I put this in the listing in the agenda, is, you know, I shared with you a draft of a paper I did with Kate Haley, who was working with Fairway in New Zealand, and she had an internship, and she was working with some Maori populations. And one of the things that's always impressed me when I go to New Zealand is it seems to me so many, at the United States, we deal with this too with our indigenous populations, but Canada and Australia, many countries are sort of trying to find a balance, trying to find a way to essentially come to terms with the history of colonialism and cruelty and racism that was involved with the founding of the country. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, it seems to me New Zealand is the farthest along in that process. I know there's always more work to be done. What Kate opened my world to, because I didn't have a lot of experience, I don't know that much about Maori culture than what I've learned in reading various books, but there is obviously traditions of dispute resolution and conflict resolution, things that we would recognize as being in line with some of the disciplines and the practices that we have in the field of conflict resolution and maybe even peacemaking more broadly, that have been part of Maori culture since time immemorial. And they have language for addressing these things and ways of thinking about these things. And I'm reluctant to pronounce any of the words because I know I would just completely mangle them. But you know, Kate introduced me to some of these concepts that are really important within Maori culture and that can be easily integrated into approaches towards conflict resolution. And one of the things that we talk about in ODR is that you know, people are worried it's going to be dehumanizing and kind of sterilizing. Gene Sternlight has written about how it ignores really the sophistication of human psychological needs in the conflict resolution process because we just put people into these algorithmic processes. And Robert Conlon has written about how it's the little boxes approach. You're just ticking boxes on a form and it spits out a resolution at the end. But what Kate exposed me to was some of these ideas. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to widen the cultural frame for some of our ODR systems design in line with what Jan has written about, to say, well, let's think about how can we integrate some of these approaches and lessons from, I guess non-Western is a big bucket, but other ways of thinking about conflict resolution. Can we integrate that into our online dispute resolution systems designs? So I just wanted to throw that open to you because you have so much experience in this. What are your thoughts in that regard?
There's about 14 different topics in there.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'm going to pick them off just a little by little. One preliminary point is that you might be aware that we recently had an election, and we have not so much a new government, but the same government.
That's right.
Better.
Jacinda. We're very jealous.
Our Jacinda, and everyone calls her by her first name. You know, it's just because everybody knows Jacinda. And in New Zealand, probably everybody does know Jacinda. But what we have now is the most diverse parliament and most diverse cabinet we've ever had.
Wow.
And for a start, I think it's 42% of the cabinet, that is ministerial posts, are held by women, which is extraordinarily high. And we have our first Maori woman Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I saw that, yeah.
And she has a traditional moko, the traditional tattoo on her chin, which is you don't choose to have that. It is a gift to you from your elders.
Wow.
And so that will be displayed on the international stage. We have in Parliament, not in the government, but in Parliament, an Iranian refugee, a Sri Lankan, and we have an Indian who's member of Parliament, no, two Indian who are now citizens. It's really diverse. Our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance is one of the 4 in Cabinet who are gay.
Wow.
And we've got to the stage where people say, yeah, move along. We don't we don't bother about that. But one of the big changes that's happened probably in the last decade is how utterly normal it is in New Zealand to greet each other in Maori. Mm-hmm. And because Maori is an official language on the radio, if we listen to our equivalent of PBS, and it's perfectly normal for the presenters, one of whom incidentally is Scottish, to start with what we call a mihi, which is a greeting in Maori. Mm. And that's what we do, because it's recognizing that Maori are 17% of the population, but they are what's referred to as the tangata whenua. They are the people of the land. Mm. And so there's now a move back to recognize what has been done in history. Histories are being rewritten as revisionist in a good sense. History is being rewritten to recognize that Maori were being rewritten out of their own history. So against that background also, there's a discussion about changing the name of the country. Mm. It's already partly changed anyway, because obviously the European name is New Zealand, which actually is a Dutch name, because Zealand from Holland, but the Maori name is Aotearoa. And so increasingly and officially, the country is referred to as Aotearoa, New Zealand. Wow. And it's that gradual acceptance. Place names have been changed. Mount Egmont, named after some Brit who never came to New Zealand, is now back to being called Taranaki. Auckland, where we now live, is referred to increasingly as Tamaki Makaurau. And that's normalizing the language. The Prime Minister will usually begin her speeches with a Maori greeting. So that's.
Well, I remember when you hosted us for the ODR forum, you brought in a Maori elder to come and welcome us and sort of explain the roots of the land that we were sitting on. I mean, like I felt it really grounded the proceedings in a place. I just think that.
Well, part of that greeting always is the convention is e na iwi, e na reo, in a whenua, you greet the people, you greet the language, you greet the mana, the spirit of the place. You acknowledge the people of the land, and then you can move on. And usually it involves being welcomed onto the land, as you were, for example, Jan and Colin, when you came to New Zealand. And there will be the cynics and the skeptics who say this is just being too PC for words, but they are now gradually disappearing. Mm. The question for us then is, given that I think Jean is right in saying this mode of communication can flatten our communication, how do we introduce some changes in that? And the paper that you passed on to me raises some of those questions. I can't speak for Maori culture. I'm not Maori. I was born in Malaysia, so I'm hardly going to speak for Maori society. But I guess there's 4 or 5 points that we could begin to think about, not just in relation to Maori, but in relation to cultural respect in our systems design. And I'd love to involve Orna and others who've been involved in writing about systems design in ODR. Because one of the key things, again, in Maori society, or we noticed this when we were working in Sri Lanka, is you begin every workshop with a ritual. There was always the candle lighting. There was always a prayer sung. In Maori society, you always begin with a song, which is a bit terrifying for those of us who have to then sing a song in Maori. But we manage, usually by hiding behind someone who can. But you learn a few. But one question then is if we're about to embark on a dispute resolution process online, how do we make room for the protocols which will include those who are from a world other than our own? In Maori society, there's usually 3 steps involved. One is the wero, W-E-R-O, which is a Māori word for challenge. You are challenged when you come onto the meeting ground. A challenge is thrown out. Are you friend? Are you foe? And usually something like a white feather is placed on the ground. And if you pick it up, you come in peace. But the challenge is thrown out. What brings you here? And then the next step is the Māori word whakapapa, which is your genealogy. What brings me here? Who am I? And what's my lineage that brings me here? And quite a bit of time is spent on that. Then only thirdly do you move to the content part, which is probably one of the words that Kate told you about, Colin, which is the whaikorero, which is the talking. And the talking takes as long as it takes. We've been part of a negotiation process about the restitution of land in New Zealand that was stolen in the 1860s. That negotiation's been going on since 1975. And there's a lot of European folks who say, for God's sake, just get on with it, pay the money and just get on with it. But the Māori say, we've been waiting since 1860 for this. We can wait. It will take as long as it takes. So the whaikorero, the talking, is a very, not ritualistic, but it's very stylized form. There are protocols, there are rules, there are ways of talking, and it finishes when the chief talks. So anyway, that's a windy way of saying, or asking, how can we build other cultural protocols into our online procedures? How do we build First Nations proceedings? I remember when I was in the Pacific some years ago in Vanuatu, which is a lovely country. Vanuatu is just gorgeous. Talking to an elder about how you go about dealing with disputes in the local villages. And there's a process, there's a protocol that's always followed. So I guess that's the first thing about how you go about protocols. Part of that too is a reminder for mediators is how you go about greetings. It's, we might have as mediators, when we move online, fairly standard and fairly perfunctory forms of greetings. It's what we usually do. Hello, my name is, who are you? Who are you now? But one of my reminders when I first started doing mediation in the mid-80s, and I was asked to go onto a Māori meeting ground to mediate a dispute between some elders and some young people about business practice. And I was all fired up with my way of doing mediation. I knew how to do these things. And the elder there said, Sonny, he called me Sonny. And damn it, I was in my 30s then, I'm sure. But Sonny said, that's not how we do things here. Okay.
That's good.
And it was just such a reminder. And I always have to ask myself, how is it you do things here?
Right.
Are any of you folks out there, are any of you scuba divers?
I'm a scuba diver.
Yeah. Yeah, you are too, Nicholas. One of the things you do is a shore orientation. You stand and look if you're diving from the shore, and if I look out here now, the sea is in no condition to go diving in. But you look at the shore, look where the rips are, look where the currents are. You do a shore orientation in a way. Going to mediation, you do the same thing. Who's here? What shapes the table? What brings us here? And it was that kind of set me back on my heels 35 years ago, and realizing, how do we do things here? It's not necessarily my way. And
one of the things, so much you said really resonates with me. And Kate did talk with me about when a conversation begins between Maori disputants in Fairway, they do have a very kind of ritualized beginning where you have to ask certain questions. And one of the things that we've documented in online dispute resolution, if you look at things like online disinhibition effect, people don't spend time on rapport building, even compared to the way they would behave face to face. People go straight into the conversation. And there's less of that sense of, oh, hello, how are you? My name is so-and-so, how's your day going? And, bonding about the weather, even if it's perfunctory, that doesn't even occur online. And I'm doing all these mediation simulations as part of Cyberweek. I will tell you, going in and looking at these 30 cases, I would guess less than 2% of them ever take any time to build any rapport between the participants. Just there's an unspoken language online, a culture that's emerged of go straight to the substance. So I think it's very interesting to look at some of these lessons from other cultures, which may help us achieve things that we know are shortcomings in our own process. And when I train mediators, I say, take the time to build that rapport, create that space for your parties. But very rarely do we frame that in terms of a cross-cultural. way, rationale, as opposed to more of a psychological rationale.
So, I wonder too, Colin, the point that you just alluded to is the very nature of this medium is speedy. Yeah,
that's right.
If you want to know something, you Google it. If you want to find where you are, you find your map on.
That's very Western, this sense of optimizing on efficiency. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that struck me, and in fact, I wrote about this in the Negotiation Journal, I don't know, 10 years ago, on cultural perceptions of time. And time in negotiation.
I think I read that. I remember that.
And that came up because of a misunderstanding that Suzanne, my wife, and I had when we were doing some training in Italy, and which is a real hardship. But when we arranged with our disputants, our participants, that we would meet for dinner, and we said, well, we've got a big day tomorrow. We've got an early start, so let's have an early dinner. And they said, oh, early dinner, come on, you don't do that in Italy. And we finally agreed that an early dinner would be 8 p.m. And not one of them turned up before 9. And what we realized, and what I realized in looking at this later, is I was working on clock time, 8 p.m. They were working on event time, dinner.
Right, dinner happens, right.
Dinner happens at 9, clock time doesn't matter. So perceptions of time are hugely different.
Yeah, and Nicholas, you had something you wanted to weigh in with.
Yes, Ian, as you say, that's probably in the Pacific Islands or from Fiji time. I'm originally from Fiji, and having lived in the Fiji and traveled in the Pacific. And I was just on before I joined this, on a training session, just started with Anna Marie and Daniel Rainey on online mediation. And what I've sort of found is, like, I had this. This is a tanoa, a kava bowl in the Pacific. Yeah. And you were talking earlier on in terms of introductory and working through. I kind of use this now as a prop to sort of say, let's have a conversation, as you say, like, because they've introduced mediation training into Fiji, and they've started off from the Singapore Mediation Center. So it's very regimented. And whereas again in Fijian culture, in the Pacific culture, even if you go across Samoa, Tonga and all of that, like Colin was saying, you don't get straight into the dispute. You got to have your conversation, have your storytelling, have your talana, have your kava around the bowl. And then slowly you sort of extract what's needed, what's going, where do you go from it? And that's, I think, when you talk about traditional aspects of dispute resolution, they've been doing that for time immemorial. I mean, for way back.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the downside that I see to that sometimes is that the conversation can keep going around the bowl unless sort of you've got someone to really extract and then sort of guide them to where to from here. And that's what I find in some of the traditional concepts. That's the sore point or the tricky part as to where do you move them along.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about that, Nicholas? Because I think the kava bowl is a lovely image. In fact, we have a kava bowl at home, which my wife brought back from, it's not a kava bowl, but she brought back from Tonga because she used to live in Tonga. And some of you will know Alan Limbury, who is a mediator based in Sydney. And he uses a small version of Aboriginal talking stick, which he doesn't use in the way in which you would in Aboriginal society, which is only the person holding the stick may talk. But I'm apprehensive about that, and I'd love your guidance on this, all of you, whether I or Alan should be using someone else's cultural props. I would not feel comfortable about using a kava bowl. I love the imagery, and if you were using it, I'd be more than comfortable with it. But I can't claim that as my own. And I mean, I might be able to find something from my Scots heritage, which probably involve a bottle of whiskey.
That's a different kind of,
There's an idea warming up here quite well. But I really love the idea that you've brought in here, Nicholas, of the idea of a centerpiece, which it's the campfire that we talk around. But at the same time, it requires moving on from that to saying, okay, now we've done that, we're ready to talk, which I think in Maori society they do. You do the talking around, and then someone says, right, we're now ready to move on.
If I may add quickly, I was in a mediation that was conducted by Alan and experienced the talking stick. there are difficulties around that. One practically, and one sort of when you look at the significance of it and all of that. But with the kava bowl, I totally agree. I mean, like, because I'm of Indian heritage, but having lived in Fiji, grown up there, and sort of come from 2 generations, I feel there is a connection. I understand the culture, and I feel that there's a lot that can resonate and you can learn from it. But yeah, I take your point in terms of, where do I draw the line? I probably would not do that if I had traditional ethnic Fijians. I might sort of I might sort of lead them to sort of take the lead on it, and I'll fiddle in rather than going in and trying to imposing what I think is the way it should be done.
Thank you.
I know Jeff has a lot of experience with this too, because he's traveled all over the world. I would say also, I was in the Peace Corps in Eritrea, and one of the things that I learned in Eritrea, again, is patience, the different nature of time. There's something called a coffee ceremony, and when you go to someone's house and they begin a coffee ceremony, it's going to take 2.5 hours, and it's very rude to not sit through 3 boilings of the coffee and pouring around, and you have to smell. I mean, you have to learn all the rituals. But when I was in Eritrea, they were writing a constitution. And someone had told them, well, you need to have a constitution. They had just finished this 36-year war of independence. So they brought in a bunch of law students from the United States and a law professor, and they started to, begin an exercise of writing a constitution. Chitu and I did a project in Afghanistan, which was something similar, where they were trying to, kind of create a culture around a new judicial layer within Afghanistan. And what we found in Afghanistan was there were traditional ways of resolving disputes that happened outside in the countryside. They had something called a shurga, which is where they bring the elders together and everyone would sit around, and usually they'd kill a goat and it'd be a whole day. And, everyone respected the recommendations from the elders. But there was, in both of these circumstances, Eritrea and Afghanistan, I felt that there was a clear kind of cultural imperialism from the legal sector to say, oh, well, you start on your feet and then you go to a horse and then you go to a bike and then you go to a car and then you go to a plane. And now you have this traditional way of resolving your disputes, and that's the equivalent of riding a horse. But we have the modern way, which is you have to have laws and you have to have courts and you have to have judges and motions and blah, blah, blah. And there was this whole notion of we have the better way and you have the old primitive way. And if you do the old primitive way, well, you're not with the times. So there was a clear value that was imposed based on the dispute resolution mechanism. And in both circumstances, I think we found that Western model of courts and judges and jails and motions and all of that was completely out of sync with the needs of the cases that were being addressed. And actually, a lot of those, what we would consider more traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, they almost read like best practices out of a mediation handbook, So that's just another thing that I think we need to maintain an openness to, and not have this value of, oh, there's a linear progress in terms of what dispute resolution looks like, and you should just go to the end point as far as you can get along that, and then you should implement that, just like cell phone towers or something. And I think that's something we need to fight back against in the field, because I think it really does smack of a certain cultural imperialism. And I think those of us in the West can bring that framework to some of our work, even subconsciously and unintentionally. We sort of impose that sense of value. So I don't know, Jeff, if you have any opinions about that too, because you've done this work all over the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. The work that we're doing right now is recognizing the fact that the existing legal system, as has been measured across the world, is just in a failed mode. We're talking about somewhere around 25 to 30% access to justice. That's the, World Law Institute's rule, index that they came out with last year at their forum. A very detailed document, but everybody's known that because that's the studies have been going on for some time now, And so the question really is, are we going to keep trying to connect to and fix what's a broken legal system? Or you're talking about Afghanistan, when we were there and looking at the systems, essentially what we found was that the existing legal structure just is looked at only by people who can afford it. And the informal justice system, which is what you were talking about, the jurglas and so forth, is essentially half to 2/3 of the population. They're figuring it out on their own. And the mediators, to the extent they are, the elders in the community, the wisdom people that are fitting into that sector. And there's no real role for something coming in from the outside in that sense. And so, you know, the work we're doing, and in fact, you know, I mentioned this to you the other day. So we're working on how do you create access to justice, building in a dispute. Well, dispute resolution is the minute you use the word dispute, you're creating an obstacle to adoption just right off the bat, because most people don't want to hear the word dispute. You know, they want relationships. So
they want a solution.
They want solution, or the maintenance of relationships. So, you know, as we're building this layer of justice for e-commerce, and we're doing it, it's actually in Africa and Australia, and we're working with new systems of identity in the blockchain. Everybody is really focusing in on these smart contracts on the blockchain. That's out there a couple of years or longer, but it's going to get into place. But the first layer of it that comes into place there's going to be 7.5 billion new forms of identity that each one of us it's going to be user-centric, which means each one of us is going to assert every aspect of our existence. And of course, if it's going to be a Maori person, you know, I mean, how do they describe, you know, how are they going to provide, you know, information, credentials, and so forth? So there's a whole mechanism for verification, which is going to be online. And what a perfect place for the work that we're doing, you know, to fit into that kind of a sector. I mean, you've been looking at all kinds of documents. It's like a civil notary system, just to use, you know, terminology of what, you know, we're getting into. That work's going to shift into an online mode. And so, you know, I'm just looking for where we can make a difference. And of course, right now, you know, in the States, the big issue is reconciliation between, you know, we now know that half the population in the States doesn't agree.
Well, I'm going to transition to that in a second, because I want to get Ian's advice about that, because he's thought about this a lot. But
and so, you know,
I'll pop
really
over
think
and
we want to position ourselves. I think we really want to position ourselves as a community where we can do the most service. And, you know, part of it is in the online world, because everybody's connecting to each other now. The youth are, you know, driving up and speaking. And so there's a role for us to help them, empower them, and use the same skill sets that we have, the same tools, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about your work at IBO, Jeff, is I think we all aspire, in terms of the technology systems design work we do, that it'll have a certain universalism, you know, like maybe a cross-cultural utility. But I think it is very important for us to think about the cultural frames we may be bringing to this work, because I certainly know that almost all of the projects I'm invited to work on, efficiency is prized. It's like, can we do it shorter? Can we do it faster? It's going to be more, it's going to save money. But to the extent that that is a Western cultural frame, I want to have the freedom to think about how to design these tools in such a way, you know, that they can be applicable to other cultures that might not prize the same values that we have in the West. So Ian, I want to leave it to you to make the last comment on this topic, please.
Yeah, well, it's probably a question rather than a comment. Just really reflecting on our conversation up to now, and some of the cross-cultural issues that I know I've encountered. Certainly here in New Zealand, if you think not so much of the Maori population, but of the Pacific Island, Samoan in particular, is a very large Samoan, Tokelau, Niuean population, for whom it is not conventional to speak up to authority. There are very strong hierarchies. And one of the issues that courts have found over the years is that asking a Samoan witness in court to answer a question is hard, because the court is authority, and you always say yes to authority. And there's always a problem of knowing whether that yes really is a yes, or it's a yes to authority. So there's not just a language translation issue, but a cultural translation issue, which we have to do offline, face-to-face, but it becomes more nuanced online. And so I'll drop that in the puddle to think about. The other is that, again, for some of those same Pacific Island cultures, it is not conventional to speak for yourself. You speak through an elder. And that means that how we set up the the online mediation or meeting may need to account for the role of the elder or the role of some spokesperson. I know about, God, how long ago? A dozen years ago, I was asked to go to a place called the Chatham Islands, which you've probably never heard of. But it's the first part of the world to see the new day. It's about, 300 kilometers to the east of Wellington. And they have pretty dreadful weather most of the time. But there was a big dispute between two factions of the one tribe, Ngāti Mutunga. And I was asked to go over there to help with that one. And that took 3 days. In fact, we didn't arrive at a resolution. But recognizing when we arrived, I and my fellow mediator, who was a retired Maori district court judge, when we arrived at the mediation room, there were 50 people there. And we said, okay, we can't have all 50 of you speaking, but who speaks? Most of the 50, well, actually 48 of the 50 said nothing. It wasn't their job to say anything. They were there as a support team. And there was one spokesperson for each side, and structuring that into an online mediation could be a little bit of a challenge, but recognizing that those people needed to be there. They were exactly who they needed to be, because their contribution was I, which is the agreement, constant little mutterings of I, knowing that we support you. In fact, most of the useful part of the mediation took place in the pub afterwards, when there's an awful lot of beer and an awful lot of other people's cigarette smoke was consumed. But yeah, there you go. But it's a question I'd love to pursue with you and anybody else, is how we recognize the flattening impact of this kind of technology, and how we build in other cultural protocols. Because your point, Colin, is particularly strong on recognizing that there is a kind of imperialism. Some years ago, when I was based in Singapore, I was asked to go to Dubai to join a well-known but shall remain unnamed international group of negotiation trainers. And their first words to this hand-picked group of political and economic leaders from Dubai was, "We're here to teach you best global practice in negotiation." The shutters came down. And basically they lost it for the next 3 days, because they're saying, we are coming from unnamed other big country to teach you guys, you poor little people, how to negotiate. And God knows that the people of Dubai know how to negotiate.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
In fact, the roles could have been reversed. They could have taught us a whole lot about negotiation.
Absolutely.
So that starting question for me is a powerful one. How do you do things here? And which helps us build these issues into our design.
It's such a rich topic. I really feel like we need to have an edited volume where we can think through some of this in more detail. I feel like it's, and I think coming up with best practice recommendations for dispute systems design for online dispute resolution, drawn from non-Western cultures, drawn from non-European cultures. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. Well, I'm cognizant of the time. I have so many other things that I wanted to raise with you, Ian. So we clearly have to do another iCoder conversation. But I do just want to ask you quickly, I want to recommend for anyone who wants to look into Ian's back catalog, he's got some amazing articles, but he wrote a wonderful article, one of my favorites, called Digital Citizens and Developing a New Rhetoric of Participatory Discourse. And one of the things you mentioned in that article is the capacity of ICT to provide venue, forum, tools, and rhetoric for the promotion of civic dialogue. And in the United States right now, we are completely riven. We are a 50-50 divided society that is at each other's throats. We cannot, and I think a lot of people in the United States would say technology is what brought us here. And they would point at Facebook and some of these new technologies as being exacerbating factors in this. So do you just, from all of your extensive thinking about this, can you give us just one little a pearl of wisdom that can help us? What is a way that we could use technology to try and heal some of these rifts, as opposed to having them exacerbated?
I wish I could do that, because if I could, then I'd be doing it. one thought following your comment is I wonder whether it's worth making contact with the team now led by Tim Berners-Lee and his colleagues at Harvard, who are trying to rebuild a new internet. Because you'll be aware that 2 or 3 years ago, that some of the founding parents of the internet produced an apology in the New York Magazine, I think it was, saying we're sorry. We didn't mean it to turn out this way, because it is a toxic cesspool of misinformation and time wasting. I mean, I don't do Facebook, I don't do Twitter, because I just can't be bothered with the noise there. But God knows the noise is elsewhere. But on that, after our election and the results came out, I made contact with a very interesting young woman, 26-year-old, a Green MP, and she has only for the second time been a Green MP to take a constituency seat, and she's taken Auckland Central, which is quite something.
Wow.
Chloe Swarbrick, very feisty young woman. And I wrote to her on this kind of question: is how do we have these conversations? We're nothing like as riven here as you might be, or in the UK. But we are divided on issues. We recently had a referenda on end-of-life choices, on euthanasia and on marijuana. The first one did pass, the second one didn't. But I guess I finished with a question, and it's one that you and I discussed, Colin, which is how we can turn this platform, or how can we take the conversations, for example, that people like Essential Partners, I don't know if you know of them, they used to be Public Conversations based out of Boston.
Right.
And now I don't know why they changed their name to Essential Partners, but they did. And I suspect rather than having the big town hall meetings, they need to be small meetings, because what Essential Partners do is bring in maybe 6 or 8 people who are representatives of the voices of the opposing factions, and not try to change their minds, not try to turn them into people that they're not, but to find ways of creating a space for respectful listening and attending, because at the heart of it is that need to be able to listen. And God knows in our political worlds, people aren't listening anymore. And all we're doing is shouting at each other. Anonymity also makes that possible. You know, if you think of the hate speech that comes through, the death threats, you know, I see the person who's been doing fact checking on Trump's speeches has himself received a lot of death threats. No, I don't have the answer. That was a very long way of saying no. Well, I don't know.
I don't think. But this is something that I also want to use our megaphone at Mediate to promote. I feel like there's a lot of healing. I think we don't talk about peacemaking in the American context. We always talk about that in other cultures, but we need some peacemaking in the U.S. And I think utilizing technology, figuring out some ways that we can do that, I think that it's really essential to the survival of the democratic project. So that was mean to throw that in at the very end, but I want to say, Ian, thank you so much for this. I knew this was going to be I knew it was going to be hard to end this conversation, but I have to respect the time that we've come up with. So if are there any last comments from the participants? Does anybody want to throw something in before we wrap it with Ian?
I don't have video, but thank you so much. This was incredible. This is Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank
My
you, Jamie.
video went away.
Your little screen, your little square on the screen, not so much lit up, but showed that you were there.
Showed you were there, exactly.
All right, I was trying, but I don't know. I'll have to work on that. What happened?
All right. Well, if anyone doesn't have another comment to make, can we please join in a round of applause to thank Ian for this great conversation?
Online. Thank you.
Online.
Really? That's weird. Great to see you. It's very weird.
Thank you so much, Ian. And we recorded this, as I said, it was not at a good time for our Israeli and European friends. So they're going to check it out tomorrow, and you may get some other questions coming into your
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
All right.
Take good care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at Cyberweek. Ciao. And Ian, I owe you one. Thank you, my brother.
We'll meet again. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.